Winter came to Halifax like a whisper that refused to leave. The harbor was a sheet of dull silver, the kind of cold that made even breath feel like work. Malcolm Reed's pickup crawled along the waterfront road, its wipers pushing slow arcs through a curtain of snow. The heater moaned, half broken, fogging the glass from the inside. Beyond the windshield, cranes stood frozen above the docks like relics of a time when the city's muscles were still made of steel. He had finished another shift that wasn't supposed to end early. Then again, nothing lately was supposed to happen the way it did. Cut hours, his supervisor said that morning, voice tight with apology. Corporate wants to tighten winter budgets, which, Malcolm thought, was a neat way of saying we'll pay you less for the same work. He didn't argue. You couldn't fight the cold when you were already standing in it. On the seat beside him lay a stack of bills wrapped with an elastic band. A silent chorus of needs: heating, groceries, Zoe's asthma medication. He rubbed a thumb against the edge of an overdue notice until the paper softened. His knuckles were cracked from years of machinery and salt air, evidence of a man who fixed what he could, even when it wasn't enough. The radio hummed an old blues station until the static swallowed it. Then came the voice of a local ad, thin, polished, detached. Beaumont Renewables seeks a field technician and personal driver, competitive pay, strict qualifications, left-handed applicants preferred, 24/7 availability required, full surveillance consent. Malcolm frowned. Left-handed. That was a first. He turned down the volume, thinking maybe he'd heard wrong, but the words stuck like frost to glass. Left-handed, surveillance driver. Strange combination, even by Halifax standards. He parked near the harbor's edge, engine idling, and reached for his phone. The job listing was there, exactly as he'd heard. A corporate posting under Beaumont Renewables, the clean energy giant run by the elusive Clara Beaumont. Everyone in Nova Scotia knew the name. To some, it meant innovation. To others, it meant quiet power. To Malcolm, it meant untouchable. He scrolled through the description. Must maintain confidentiality. Must not initiate conversation while transporting executives. Must agree to periodic performance evaluation through recorded data. A contract written for ghosts, not men. He almost laughed. Then he thought of Zoe. The doctor's note from last week flashed in his mind. Prescription renewed, but insurance running thin. The pharmacy clerk's gentle voice. You might want to ask about the generic option next time. Next time. There was always a next time waiting for people like him. He leaned back, listening to the wind batter the truck's sides. Halifax was a city of survivalists. Fishermen, welders, immigrants, dreamers, all balancing pride and exhaustion on the same frozen deck. Malcolm was one of them, a Navy mechanic once, now a maintenance tech for a company that could replace him with a machine. His life had narrowed into work, bills, and the fragile laughter of his 8-year-old daughter at night. He opened the glove compartment and pulled out a thermos. Coffee gone cold hours ago. He drank anyway. It burned just enough to feel real. For a moment, he stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror, the dark circles beneath his eyes, the streaks of gray near his temples. Not old, but worn by repetition, the kind of tired that doesn't show up in medical charts. Left-handed, he murmured again, testing the phrase like a code. He flexed his left hand, still calloused from ship engines. Maybe that counted for something. Maybe not. Snow thickened. Streetlights flickered on in slow sequence, casting long amber beams across the road. He started the truck and turned toward downtown, toward the tower that bore the name Beaumont in silver letters that caught no warmth from the setting sun. Traffic thinned as he entered the financial district. Glass towers rose like glaciers, each one reflecting the other, until the skyline became a hall of mirrors. At a stoplight, he watched a young couple cross the street, bundled in designer coats, laughing. For a brief second, he envied their ease, the luxury of believing everything ahead would be kind. When the light turned green, he drove on. The Beaumont building stood at the corner of Hollis and Barrington, 30 stories of glass and white stone facing the Atlantic. He parked across the street, engine running, and stared. The entrance gleamed under motion lights, revolving doors turning with silent precision. 2 guards in dark coats flanked the doorway, their faces smooth, unreadable. He imagined walking in, handing over his resume, hearing them say the same words the city had said to him 1,000 times, "We'll call you." But he also imagined Zoe's small hands clutching her inhaler. He imagined the tiny coughs she tried to hide when she didn't want him to worry. He reached into his coat, pulled out a worn notebook, his life ledger, Zoe called it. On the first page, in her handwriting, was a message scrawled in purple crayon. "Daddy, you can fix anything." He smiled faintly. Maybe not everything, he thought, but maybe enough. He turned off the truck. The silence that followed was heavy, but not empty. He stepped out into the cold, boots crunching against the salted pavement, and crossed the street. The wind off the harbor hit his face like ice water. His breath came in sharp clouds. Inside the lobby, light spilled from the marble floor, bright and sterile. People moved like clockwork, badges, tablets, purpose. Malcolm paused near the security desk, snow melting on his shoulders. "Can I help you, sir?" the guard asked, polite but practiced. Malcolm nodded once. "You're hiring," he said quietly. "I'm here to apply." The guard handed him a tablet. "Name?" "Reed," he said. "Malcolm Reed." As he typed, he caught his reflection in the glass. Just another man chasing a chance, but this time the chase felt different. Maybe it was the way the light glared off the glass, or the way his heart didn't flinch. Outside, the snow kept falling, blurring the world into shades of white and silver. Inside, his name appeared on the screen under a banner. "Application submitted. Technician, driver, Beaumont Renewables." He exhaled slowly. Sometimes, change begins not with a door opening, but with a man deciding to walk through it anyway. If you've ever had to start over, when the odds, the rules, or the cold felt too much, hit that like button, share your story below. And remember, every small act of courage keeps another light burning through the winter. The next morning, broken shades of gray, the kind Halifax specialized in, sky and ocean blending into one long sigh. Malcolm's alarm buzzed at 5:30, though he hadn't really slept. He ironed his one good shirt in the half-light of the kitchen, steam curling into the cold air like ghosts of better mornings. Zoe stirred in her blanket fort on the couch, her soft breathing steady. He watched her for a moment, that tiny heartbeat of reason behind every long day, then buttoned his collar and whispered, "Wish me luck, kiddo." By 7, he stood in the marble lobby of the Beaumont Tower, surrounded by silence so polished it almost echoed. The security guard from last night glanced up, recognition flickering. "Interview." Malcolm nodded. 38th floor, the man said, tone clipped. "Wait by the glass wall. They'll call you." The elevator ride felt longer than it was, its hum swallowed by the weight of nerves and fluorescent light. When the doors opened, the floor was still, a museum of glass, steel, and money. A receptionist with hair like sculpture tapped on a tablet without looking up. "Malcolm Reed," he said softly. "Wait by the window," she replied, voice flat. "Ms. Beaumont will call you when ready." He obeyed. Outside, Halifax sprawled beneath him, cranes frozen mid-gesture over the harbor. Ships were dots against the silver sea. The higher you climbed in the city, he thought, the quieter it became. 20 minutes passed. Then the door at the end of the hall opened with the hiss of precision hinges. A woman stepped out, tall, slim, the kind of composure that made air rearrange itself. Her hair was pale as frost, drawn into a knot so sharp it could cut glass. Clara Beaumont. She didn't offer her hand. "Mr. Reed," she said. Her voice was clear, exact, and cool enough to lower the room's temperature. She turned and motioned him inside. The office was minimalist. White marble, a single abstract painting, a wall of glass overlooking the harbor. No warmth, no clutter, just control. She gestured toward a chair. He sat, careful to keep his posture straight. You applied for technician and personal. Driver, she began, scanning her tablet. Military background? Yes, ma'am. Royal Canadian Navy, mechanical engineer, 10 years. Disciplinary record? None. Marital status? Widowed. Children? 1. My daughter Zoe. She's 8. Her eyes flicked up then, pale blue and assessing. Do you have ancestors who settled in Canada before 1800? The question caught him off guard. Excuse me. She repeated it, same tone, same stillness. Your lineage, Mr. Reed. Do you know it? He hesitated. My mother's side traced back to Nova Scotia long before Confederation. My father's family moved here from the Caribbean in the 50s. She nodded once as if the words were data, not history. So, partial lineage, she said, typing something. Are you left-handed? He blinked. No. Right. Mostly right. Without warning, she slid a silver pen across the desk. Catch. Instinct made him grab it with his left. The pen struck his palm, wobbling but not falling. Her expression didn't change, though something unreadable flickered behind her eyes. Adequate, she murmured. For a moment, only the hum of the heating system filled the room. You understand the terms of employment? Yes, ma'am, he said evenly. Left-handed preferred. Uniform required. No personal items in the vehicle. No conversation unless spoken to. Full-time surveillance. And? He took a breath. Confidentiality agreement. No record of employment allowed to be shared publicly. Her head tilted slightly. Good memory. He didn't reply. Clara Beaumont stood, her shadow cutting across the white floor. You'll report Monday, 5 a.m. sharp. Don't be late. She walked toward the window, the city reflected in her glassy outline. And one more thing, she said without turning. Don't speak unless spoken to. The meeting was over before he could exhale. She didn't shake his hand, didn't smile, just dismissed him with a nod so small it could have been a twitch. He left the office the way he'd entered, quietly, invisibly. In the elevator, his reflection stared back from mirrored walls. Tall, tired, jaw tight. He wasn't angry. Not exactly. It was more complicated, humiliation mixed with resolve, the kind of emotion that simmers instead of burns. At the lobby, the same guard gave a half smile. You'll last longer than most, he said. Or maybe not. Malcolm didn't answer. He stepped out into the brittle afternoon, where the cold wind tore across the harbor and the sky hung low with snow. By the time he reached home, dusk had folded over the city. The apartment was small but warm, lit by the yellow hum of a single lamp. Zoe was at the table coloring, humming to herself. When she looked up, her face brightened. Daddy, did she like you? He took off his jacket, the cold still clinging to it. He thought for a moment, then said softly, She didn't. Slammed the door. Zoe tilted her head. That's good, right? He smiled faintly. It's a start. She handed him her drawing, a stick figure of him beside her, both holding hands, standing under a big sun that took up half the page. That's us, she said proudly. You look happy. He studied the drawing, then looked toward the small bathroom mirror across the room. In it, his reflection stared back, eyes steady, not defeated. Somewhere between pride and exhaustion, a trace of something else flickered. Hope. Small but stubborn, like a light refusing to go out in winter. He pinned Zoe's drawing to the fridge, next to the overdue notice. The two pieces of paper, one demand, one dream, fluttered side by side in the draft. For the first time that day, he let himself smile. The morning arrived before the sun did. Halifax slept under a skin of frost. The streets glazed in white silence. In the half-light, Malcolm's breath fogged as he stepped out of his building. gloved hands tightening around the keys. The wind off the harbor bit through his coat. It was 4:47 a.m. The black sedan waited in the private garage of the Beaumont Tower, its body shining under fluorescent light. The car smelled of leather, order, and new money. A small red dot blinked steadily on the dash. The recording system. Surveillance, just like the contract promised. Malcolm checked the mirrors, adjusted the seat, and stared at his reflection in the windshield. A soldier-turned-driver, a man trying not to look like he needed this job as much as he did. At 5 a.m. sharp, the elevator door slid open. Clara Beaumont stepped out, wrapped in a charcoal coat, hair pinned tight, eyes hidden behind tinted glasses, though the world outside was still dark. She moved with the silence of someone used to being obeyed. Malcolm opened the rear door and stepped aside. "Good morning, ma'am," he said quietly. No response. She slid into the back seat, set down a slim laptop case, and put on her wireless earbuds. The faint click of classical piano drifted from them. Notes clipped, disciplined, lonely. He closed the door, walked around to the driver's seat, and started the engine. The red light blinked twice, then steadied again. Recording live. The car rolled out of the underground garage and into the empty streets. Snow hissed beneath the tires, the city still caught between night and morning. Neither spoke. From the rearview mirror, Malcolm could see her profile. Sharp lines, composed expression, eyes fixed on the window. Her hand, pale against the dark coat, adjusted her scarf. For a moment, the fabric slipped, and he saw it. A faint bruise just above her collarbone, round, blurred at the edges, the color of an old storm. He looked away quickly. He had learned in the Navy that some things demanded silence, not out of fear, but respect for what pain refused to confess. This, he decided, was one of those times. At the next red light, the soft reflection of the camera blinked across her face like a tiny heartbeat. The image unsettled him. The idea that every breath, every twitch, was being recorded for someone else's judgment. He drove on. The city began to wake. Delivery trucks grinding down icy lanes. A fisherman hauling crates near the docks. The faint glow of cafe signs flickering to life. Halifax in winter had its own rhythm, weary but persistent. "Left turn," Clara said suddenly, her voice low but precise. "Yes, ma'am." He followed the GPS toward the older quarter of the city, where cobblestone streets sloped toward the sea. The buildings here were relics, brick facades and creaking shutters, ghosts of Halifax colonial bones. "Stop here," she said. The address wasn't on the itinerary. He parked beside a narrow stone building that might once have been a church or a bank. Its windows were frosted, its door marked only by the faint lettering of a charity foundation. "I won't be long," she said, already opening the door. Malcolm nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She disappeared inside, heels echoing against the old stone steps. He waited. The car's heater hummed. The red light blinked on the dash, patient and watchful. Outside, the snow softened to drizzle, melting against the windshield in uneven streaks. Malcolm drummed his fingers once, then stilled them. His military discipline wouldn't let him fidget. Through the windshield, he watched a group of volunteers wheel boxes into the building. Food donations, it looked like. A woman in a red coat greeted Clara at the door, embracing her briefly before leading her inside. Minutes stretched. He thought of Zoe still asleep under her blanket fort, one hand clutching the stuffed penguin she refused to outgrow. The thought brought a warmth that no heater could. 25 minutes later, the door opened again. Clara stepped out alone. Her posture was still perfect, but something in her face had shifted. Her eyes, always guarded, were rimmed red. She slipped on her sunglasses before he could be sure. He got out, opened the rear door. She entered without a word. "Home?" he asked softly. "Office," she said. He nodded. They drove through the waking city, the silence between them heavier than before. From the corner of his eye, he caught her reflection, still, distant, hands clasped too tightly in her lap. The camera blinked. The car hummed forward. The world outside turned from gray to white. By the time they reached the tower, she had already retreated behind her tablet screen. 5 a.m. again tomorrow, she said without looking up. Yes, ma'am. She stepped out. The automatic doors swallowed her whole, and just like that, she was gone, leaving only the faint trace of perfume and the echo of things unsaid. Malcolm parked the car, turned off the ignition, and sat in the quiet for a long time. The red light dimmed, ending the recording. He rubbed a hand over his face, the fatigue deeper than the hour could explain. That night, back home, Halifax was hushed beneath steady snow. The radiator clanged in protest against the cold. Zoe coughed in her sleep, soft, shallow, rhythmic. Malcolm sat by her bedside, adjusting the blanket, watching her small chest rise and fall. He reached for the inhaler on the nightstand, checked it out of habit. Almost empty. The wind rattled the window pane, and somewhere deep in his mind, a thought surfaced. Not quite a prayer, not yet a fear. You work so she can breathe. He whispered it once, as if saying it aloud would make it true. Then he sat back, the dim lamp catching the exhaustion on his face. Outside, the snow fell again, quiet, relentless, covering the city in another layer of silence. Snow fell again the next morning, softer this time, like the city had decided to whisper instead of shout. Halifax under snow always looked calm from a distance, but Malcolm knew the truth. It was the kind of calm that froze everything still, including people who didn't have the luxury to stop moving. He arrived at Beaumont Tower just before 5. The garage lights flickered overhead as he unlocked the car, brushing thin flakes from the windshield. The same red camera light blinked, steady and unblinking. He'd stopped noticing it, or at least tried to. At exactly 5:02, the elevator opened and Clara Beaumont appeared, as precise as a clock's tick. Today she wore a navy wool coat and black gloves, her pale hair pulled back in a low twist. She carried no laptop this time, only a folder clutched tight against her chest. Malcolm opened the back door. "Good morning, ma'am." She slid in, silent as usual, but didn't reach for her earbuds. That was new. He waited for the first address to appear on the onboard screen. Her office, her meetings, all the usual coordinates, but instead, she spoke. "Drive me to North End." He hesitated just a fraction. That part of the city wasn't on her schedule. "Yes, ma'am." She looked out the window, face unreadable. "Don't use the route system. Just drive." He nodded once, shifted into gear, and eased the car into the dim light of morning. The roads north of downtown were still slick, the snow packed into uneven ruts. The city shifted as they drove, high glass fading to red brick, office towers giving way to narrow streets lined with row houses and shuttered stores. The kind of neighborhood that didn't get featured in tourism ads but carried the heartbeat of the city just the same. Silence filled the car, not heavy this time, but waiting. When they passed the old viaduct, Clara spoke again, quietly. "My family once owned land here." Malcolm's eyes flicked to the mirror. She was watching the passing streets as if they were ghosts. "They called it Beaumont Square," she continued. "But before that, before my grandfather, there was a community here. Craftsmen, shipbuilders, families who came from the islands. After the war, people who built this part of Halifax with their hands." Her voice tightened, as if every word was cutting through layers she'd tried to forget. "When the city expanded, my family bought it all. Papers were signed, names erased. They built factories, housing for workers. Then, when the economy shifted, they abandoned it. All of it. And the records of who came before, gone." The windshield wipers swept rhythmically, the only sound between them. After a moment, Malcolm asked softly, "Is that where we're going?" She nodded. They drove another 5 minutes before she said, "There." He pulled the car to the curb beside an old chapel, wooden, leaning slightly, its white paint peeling in long curls. Snow had collected on the steps untouched. The sign above the door was faded, but still legible. New Dawn Mission. Established, 1892. Clara stared at it through the glass. "My family funded this chapel when they took the land. A way to look generous, I suppose." She exhaled. "They also buried the name of the man who built it, Samuel Grant. He was a carpenter from Trinidad. He designed this entire street. The records say he never existed." Her voice broke just slightly, more from control than emotion. Malcolm studied the building, its tired roof, its crooked bell tower, and said quietly, "Erasure doesn't last forever." For the first time since he'd met her, she looked directly at him, not as an employee, not as a shadow behind the wheel, but as a person. Their eyes met in the mirror, hers pale, uncertain, his steady, without pity. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was human. She said nothing more. After a minute, she opened the folder in her lap, glanced at the documents inside, and closed it again. "Drive back," she said softly. The return trip was wordless. The sun had risen by then, weak and filtered through snow clouds, turning the harbor to liquid pewter. Malcolm dropped her at the tower entrance. Before getting out, she paused, hand on the door handle. "Thank you," she said, almost inaudible. He nodded once. "You're welcome, ma'am." Then she was gone again, swallowed by marble and glass. That evening, the city had thawed just enough for water to drip from rooftops in slow, steady beats. Malcolm's apartment smelled faintly of soup and old books. Zoe sat cross-legged on the floor, crayons scattered around her. "Did the lady ride with you again today?" she asked without looking up. "She did." "Did she talk?" "A little." Zoe hummed thoughtfully, her crayon sweeping across the page. "Was she nice?" He smiled faintly. "She's learning." Zoe grinned. "So she's like my teacher when she tries to smile but forgets how." Malcolm chuckled. "Something like that." She finished the drawing and held it up proudly. 3 figures under a blue sky. One tall, one small, one in a long gray coat. The taller figure held the little one's hand. The woman stood beside them, expressionless but surrounded by color. "Who's that?" he asked, pointing. "That's me, you, and the lady who forgot how to smile," Zoe said. He looked at it for a long moment, a mix of amusement and ache in his chest. When she went to brush her teeth, he pinned the drawing to the fridge beside the others. The crayon figures looked almost alive in the glow of the kitchen light, a child's small attempt to fix what the world had erased. He poured himself tea, sat by the window, and stared at the harbor's reflection, the snow melting, the city shifting beneath it. Somewhere, a woman with pale hair was sitting in a tower, holding the same silence he was. For the first time, Malcolm wondered if maybe, just maybe, silence wasn't the end of their conversation. It was the beginning. The sky over Halifax was the color of iron the next morning, flat, cold, and heavy. Snow clung to the corners of the streets like memories that refused to melt. Malcolm parked the car outside Beaumont Tower, engine humming in the dim light. He'd gotten used to the silence of waiting, the quiet minutes before Clara appeared, every second stretched tight as wire. At 7:05, the elevator doors opened. Clara Beaumont emerged in a tailored gray coat, hair pinned precisely, folder in hand. She didn't carry the chill of the weather. She carried her own kind of frost. "Good morning, ma'am," Malcolm said, standing beside the car door. "Provincial Archives," she replied simply, sliding into the back seat. No explanation, no tone, just command. The car merged into traffic, tires hissing against the slush. Outside, the harbor fog hung low, swallowing sound. Inside, the red camera light blinked on the dash, the constant third presence between them. Clara stared out the window, expression unreadable. Her hand rested on the folder, fingers tight around its edges. After several minutes, Malcolm broke the silence, his voice careful. The archives aren't on the schedule, ma'am. I know, she said. This isn't business. He nodded once, then focused on the road. They drove north through the city, past the old naval yard, and into a quiet part of town where government buildings stood like relics of paper and dust. The provincial archives of Nova Scotia loomed ahead, a sandstone structure weathered by salt air and bureaucracy. Clara stepped out, coat drawn close, and motioned for Malcolm to follow. I'll need your help carrying files, she said. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and forgotten winters. Shelves stretched endlessly, filled with labeled boxes and silent histories. A clerk behind the counter, an elderly woman with glasses perched on her nose, looked up when they approached. Looking for birth records? She asked. Clara placed the folder on the counter. Corporate registrations, Beaumont Engineering, year range 1969 to 1975. Specifically, any mention of Amelia Grant. The clerk typed slowly, the keyboard clicking like a metronome in the stillness. That's a long time back, she murmured. Might take a minute. They waited. Clara stood perfectly still, her eyes on the wall of filing cabinets behind the counter, as if she could will them to give up their secrets. Malcolm watched her, not the CEO now, but a woman chasing a ghost. After several long minutes, the clerk disappeared into the stacks. When she returned, she carried a thin, dust-covered folder. Only one record, she said, placing it gently on the desk. Company charter, amendments, board minutes, 1971. Clara reached for it, hesitated, then opened it slowly. The paper inside was brittle, edges yellowed. Her eyes scanned the pages, and then she stopped. There it was, Amelia Grant, listed as co-founder and lead engineer, her signature in ink beside Edward Beaumont, Clara's father. But in the following amendments, her name vanished, struck through, replaced, as if she had never existed. Clara's breath hitched. Her hand trembled slightly, the paper rustling under her fingers. She was one of ours, she whispered. She built the early turbine models. I read about the designs in my father's journals, but he never mentioned her name. Malcolm said nothing at first. He looked at the signature. 2 names, one erased by privilege, one preserved by silence. Then quietly, truth buried doesn't mean dead. Clara's eyes lifted to him, startled. For a heartbeat, the mask she always wore cracked. There was no command in her gaze now, only disbelief. And something close to sorrow. She closed the folder carefully, as if afraid it might break. Make me a copy, she said to the clerk. Her voice steadied again, but her fingers betrayed her, still trembling, faintly. While the clerk disappeared with the file, Clara turned to the window. Snow had begun to fall again, faint and soundless against the glass. He erased her, she said, almost to herself, just like the others. Partnerships reworded, patents reassigned, legacy rewritten. My family built an empire out of selective memory. Malcolm's voice was calm, but firm. Then, maybe you're the one meant to remember. She looked at him, really looked, and for the first time, she didn't seem insulted by his words. She nodded slightly, as though accepting something long overdue. The clerk returned with the copies and handed them over. Clara signed a receipt, then turned to Malcolm. Let's go. They walked back through the archive hall, their footsteps echoing against the marble. The world outside felt colder now, sharper. Clara held the folder close to her chest as though protecting it from the air. When they reached the car, she paused before getting in. Tomorrow, she said quietly, eyes on the gray horizon. Arlington Cemetery, 6 a.m. Malcolm nodded, surprised. Yes, ma'am. Should I? She cut him off, gently. Bring your own coat. Her tone was softer this time, not an order, but an invitation. As he watched her settle into the back seat, the snow started to fall heavier, swirling like ash around the car. The red light blinked again on the dashboard, recording every second of silence. On the drive back, neither spoke, but something unspoken had shifted. a current running beneath the quiet. Clara Beaumont, the woman of glass and steel, had seen a fracture in her own foundation, and Malcolm, the man of silence, had been there to witness it, steady, unseen, and necessary. By the time they reached the tower, the streets were white again, the world reset. She stepped out without a word, folder tucked under her arm, shoulders squared against the wind. Malcolm watched her go, then looked up at the glass facade of the building that bore her family's name. In its reflection, snow turned to silver, and for the briefest moment, he thought of all the names the snow might be hiding, and all the truths waiting to be found beneath it. Morning came wrapped in sleet and silence. The sky above Halifax hung low and bruised, the kind of gray that seemed to press against the earth itself. The roads shimmered under a mix of snow and rain, thin layers of ice catching the first hesitant light. Malcolm had been up since before dawn. He dressed quietly in the dark. Black coat, gloves, boots polished more out of habit than vanity. When he stepped outside, the cold bit through everything. The air smelled faintly of salt and metal, a reminder that the harbor was never far away. He drove through streets that felt deserted, the city still caught in the fragile pause between storm and sunrise. At 6 sharp, he pulled into the narrow lane leading to Arlington Cemetery. The gates stood open, snow crusting their iron bars. Beyond them, the gravestones rose in uneven rows, white against white. Clara was already there. She stood near the far edge of the grounds, her figure small against the expanse of marble and frost. Her black coat billowed slightly in the wind, a single bouquet of lilies cradled in her gloved hands. Malcolm parked the car and approached without a word. Each step crunched softly in the frozen grass. The world around them had gone completely still. No birds, no passing cars, only the hush of fallen snow and the faint creak of branches heavy with ice. He stopped a few paces behind her. From there, he could see the gravestone, plain, unmarked, its surface roughened by years of neglect. No inscription, no name, just a life erased into anonymity. Clara knelt slowly, the bouquet trembling slightly in her hands. She brushed away the thin layer of frost covering the stone. Then, with a deliberate gentleness, she laid the lilies down. Her voice was quiet, nearly swallowed by the wind. You existed. The words hung in the air, fragile, defiant, sacred. Malcolm felt them more than heard them. Something in his chest tightened. He looked away, blinking against the sting in his eyes. For all the rules she lived by, for all the control she'd built around herself, this moment was raw, a crack through which humanity finally broke through. She stayed there for a long while, head bowed, gloved fingers resting lightly on the stone as if to apologize to it or to steady herself. When she rose, her knees left faint impressions in the snow. She didn't turn around immediately. Her breath came out in visible clouds. Then, finally, she said, "My father visited this place every year. I thought it was for his friends. I never asked." Malcolm's voice was low, steady. "He came here for her." "Yes," Clara whispered, "for her and for the guilt he could never bury deep enough." A pause, the kind that weighs, not lingers. She looked down again, her face pale but calm. She should have had a name here, a record, a story that wasn't hidden in archives. Malcolm took a step closer, his boots crunching through the snow. She does now. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze was something wordless, respect, grief, and a quiet acknowledgement of all that history had taken. They walked back to the car side by side, not speaking. The snow fell heavier now, thick flakes swirling like slow-burning ash. When they reached the car, Clara paused before getting in. Her hand lingered on the door handle. "I need someone I can trust," she said. Malcolm looked at her, the condensation from his breath hanging between them like smoke. "Then I'll stand," he said simply. For a moment, neither moved. The air between them felt charged, not with attraction, but with understanding. Two people, once strangers, now bound by truth neither of them could unsee. Clara finally nodded. "There's more to uncover," she said softly. "And I can't do it alone." Malcolm inclined his head. "You won't have to." As he drove her back through the city, the world outside blurred, houses softened by snow, lights glowing faintly through the fog. Inside the car, it was quiet, but no longer tense. The kind of silence that grows after something honest has been spoken. At a red light near the harbor, Clara looked out over the frozen water. "You ever think about how names can outlive the people who own them?" Malcolm answered after a beat. "Sometimes names die first, but if someone remembers, maybe that's enough." She nodded, eyes distant. "Then maybe memory is the truest kind of justice." He didn't reply, but she could see his reflection in the glass, the faint curve of a smile that wasn't quite happiness, but peace. When they reached the tower, she gathered her coat, stepping out into the swirling snow. 5 a.m. tomorrow, she said, the familiar cadence of command softened by gratitude. He nodded. "I'll be here." She hesitated, then added quietly, "Thank you, Malcolm." It was the first time she'd said his name aloud. It sounded different, coming from her. Less formal, more human. As she disappeared into the building, Malcolm stood beside the car for a while, watching the snow fill her footprints until the path was clean again. He looked up at the tower, its mirrored glass glinting with dawn, and thought of the nameless stone at Arlington. It too was covered now, but beneath the snow lay something restored. Not marble, not legacy, but truth. And in that truth, a name, Amelia Grant, had begun to breathe again. The snow outside Beaumont Tower had stopped, but the cold inside the glass and steel building felt sharper than ever. The boardroom stretched like a battlefield, polished wood, portraits of former executives, the Beaumont family crest glinting above a screen waiting to flicker with judgment. Clara sat at the head of the long table, every movement deliberate, her face composed into the calm mask of a woman trained to withstand storms. Around her sat 12 directors, men and women who measured loyalty in dividends and silence. Malcolm stood near the door, quiet in his dark coat, a shadow in a room of bright suits. At the far end, Marcus Holcomb, chief financial officer and Clara's father's oldest ally, cleared his throat. His voice carried the easy arrogance of someone who believed legacy was a shield. "Before we begin," he said, adjusting his tie, "I'd like to address the issue of optics." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Your so-called diversity initiative, Clara. Veterans, low-income hires, community partnerships, admirable on paper, disastrous in practice." A murmur of agreement rippled through the table. Marcus leaned forward. "Our investors are nervous. They think you've become sentimental. Charity doesn't build profit." Clara's hands rested calmly on the table, but Malcolm could see the pulse at her temple. "Profit without integrity," she said evenly, "is a legacy that collapses on itself." Marcus chuckled. "Your father would disagree. He built this empire on control, not confession. You—" He paused, glancing briefly toward Malcolm. "You've let the help into the temple." The room tightened. Eyes darted. Words like that, spoken aloud in 2025, still carried centuries in their weight. Clara didn't react. She simply turned her head slightly. "Mr. Jennings," she said quietly, her tone neither command nor plea, "would you please step forward?" Malcolm moved toward the table, his steps measured, the sound of his boots echoing off marble and glass. He stopped beside her, pulled a small silver flash drive from his coat pocket, and placed it gently before her. Clara looked directly at Marcus. "You say optics. I say evidence." Her assistant connected the drive to the conference system. A moment later, the speakers filled with sound, the muffled clink of glasses, the familiar voices of Marcus and two other board members caught in casual cruelty. "She's making this personal," threatened the driver's kid. "Maybe she'll back off." "Zoe, isn't it? The girl with asthma? Pity. Shame if her school funding got complicated." Laughter. Then Marcus's voice again, smooth and cold. "Fear is the oldest negotiation tool." The room froze. Marcus went pale. One of the directors pushed her chair back, hand over her mouth. Another muttered, "Jesus Christ." Clara waited until the recording ended, the last echo of laughter dying like smoke. Then she said, quietly but with precision, "That was 2 weeks ago, recorded in this very building." Marcus sputtered. You're violating privacy laws." "No," she interrupted. "You violated decency. You weaponized fear against a child." The silence that followed wasn't the polite kind. It was the kind that comes when walls finally crack. Clara stood. "He's not just a driver," she said, her voice steady, carrying across the room. "He's the reason you're hearing truth today." Malcolm didn't move. He didn't have to. His presence, his calm, his restraint filled the space like gravity. The chairman, an older man with trembling hands, cleared his throat. This will require an inquiry," he said weakly. Clara's gaze never left Marcus. "Do that," she replied, "but make sure it's public." She gathered her papers, not waiting for permission to leave. The directors shifted uncomfortably, their hierarchy suddenly fragile. As she passed Marcus, she stopped for a brief moment beside his chair. "My father built this company on silence," she said softly. "But silence is no longer an asset." Then she walked out, heels striking the marble in steady rhythm. Malcolm followed, the door closing behind them with the soft click of inevitability. Outside, the hallway was empty. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and fear. Clara exhaled slowly, her breath shaking for the first time in months. "You recorded them?" she asked quietly, eyes forward. Malcolm nodded. "For protection, not just mine." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You knew before I did." "I saw it coming," he said. "Men like him always believe people like us don't listen." She turned her head toward him, studying the calm resolve in his eyes. "And yet, here you are, making them listen." He didn't smile, but his voice softened. "Some truths need a driver." They exited the tower through the side corridor that led to the private parking deck. Rain had started again, mixing with the remnants of snow, washing the night in streaks of silver. Clara stopped by the car door and looked out into the blur of the city. "My father's coming tonight," she said. "He asked for a meeting." Malcolm adjusted his gloves. "He'll want control back." She nodded. "And I'll want answers." Later that evening, she sat across from her father in her penthouse study. The man who had once towered over boardrooms now looked smaller, older, his eyes more like mirrors than windows. "You made a spectacle of us," he said. "I told the truth," Clara replied. "Something you forgot how to do." He sighed, the sound like an old door closing. "Truth doesn't build empires." "No," she said, "but it keeps them from rotting." He rose slowly, his face unreadable. "You think you're fixing this. You're just undoing your inheritance." Then, without another word, he turned and left, the echo of his footsteps fading down the marble hall. Clara stood still long after he was gone. Through the window, the city lights shimmered on wet glass. Down below, Malcolm waited in the car, headlights casting a soft glow on the pavement. She looked out into the night, the storm, the silence, the man who had chosen to stand, and whispered almost to herself, "Let it rot then. What grows after might finally be real." The invitation arrived quietly, a message, not an order. "Dinner, tonight, no staff. Bring Zoe." Malcolm stared at the screen for a long moment before showing it to his daughter. Zoe's eyes lit up. "She invited us? To her house?" He nodded, cautious but curious. "Seems so." Outside, Halifax was wrapped in the kind of late winter dusk that blurs the line between snow and sky. Streetlights glowed in pools of amber as they drove toward the Beaumont residence, a townhouse overlooking the harbor, its windows warm against the cold. When they arrived, Clara opened the door herself. No uniformed guard, no assistant, just her. Hair loose for once, wearing a soft gray sweater instead of the steel-pressed suits that had become her armor. "Come in," she said. Her voice carried neither command nor hesitation. The house smelled of rosemary and roasted vegetables. On the dining table, 3 simple plates were set, steam rising from a casserole dish at the center. There was no silverware polished to mirror shine, no folded napkins like shields, only dinner. Zoe peeked around, eyes wide at the tall bookshelves and the faint sound of waves against the harbor wall. "It's so quiet here," she whispered. Clara smiled faintly. "It wasn't always." Malcolm helped Zoe out of her coat and hung it by the door. For the first time since he had met Clara Beaumont, he felt no need to stand at attention. They sat together at the small wooden table. Clara poured water, not wine. "I hope you don't mind a modest meal," she said. "It's been years since I cooked for anyone." Malcolm looked at the spread: baked salmon, roasted potatoes, fresh bread still warm. "Looks better than half the restaurants downtown," he said. Zoe grinned. "Daddy's the real cook at home, but I make the best cereal." Clara laughed softly, the sound surprising even her. "Then we'll trade recipes." Dinner began quietly. Forks clicked, conversation tentative. The warmth of the food eased what years of distance had built between them. Clara asked Zoe about school, and the little girl answered between bites, telling stories of her teacher, her drawings, and her best friend, who had just moved away. "And you, Miss Clara?" Zoe asked suddenly. "Do you play piano?" Clara's hand froze midway to her glass. The question landed gently, but the echo behind it was deep. She lowered her hand slowly. "I used to," she said. Her tone was soft, almost nostalgic. "When I was about your age, there was an old upright in my father's house. I played until one day I didn't." "Why not?" Clara hesitated, then smiled faintly, not out of joy, but memory. "Because the piano disappeared, and I thought the music went with it." Zoe's brow furrowed in childlike logic. "Music doesn't disappear, it hides until someone plays again." Malcolm looked across the table at Clara. For once, she didn't look away. After dinner, Clara rose and motioned toward the adjoining room. "Come," she said. They followed her into the parlor. In the corner stood a weathered upright piano, its surface scratched and dulled by time. "I bought this one from a church sale last month," she said quietly. "I didn't even know why. Maybe now I do." Zoe approached it with reverence. "Can I?" she asked, glancing at her father. Malcolm nodded. "Go on, sweetheart." Zoe climbed onto the stool, tiny fingers hovering uncertainly above the keys. She pressed one, then another, soft, hesitant notes that floated through the room, like ghosts remembering how to breathe. Then, with quiet confidence, she began to play "You Are My Sunshine." The melody filled the space, simple, fragile, and impossibly pure. The piano was slightly out of tune, but it didn't matter. It was real. Clara leaned against the doorway, her arms crossed loosely. For the first time, she didn't look like an executive. She looked like someone who had lost something once and just found it again. When Zoe finished, the room fell into a gentle silence. Only the hum of the harbor wind remained. "That was beautiful," Clara whispered. Zoe smiled proudly. "It's my mom's favorite song." She glanced at her father. "Right, Daddy?" Malcolm nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, it was." Clara's eyes softened. "Then we'll call it our song now." The little girl giggled, climbing off the stool. Clara knelt beside her. "Thank you for reminding me," she said. "For what?" "That music doesn't disappear." Malcolm helped clear the table afterward. though Clara protested. "You're my guest," she said. He smiled. "Then let me return the favor next time." Her expression faltered, not out of refusal, but because the word next time felt new, almost hopeful. When the dishes were done, Zoe curled up on the couch under a wool blanket, half asleep. Clara poured 2 cups of tea and handed one to Malcolm. The scent of mint rose in the quiet. "Do you ever think about what forgiveness costs?" she asked suddenly. He considered. "More than pride, less than truth." She nodded, staring into her cup. "I think I'm beginning to understand that." They sat in silence, the room dim except for the amber glow of the fireplace. Outside, snow drifted lightly past the window. When it was time to leave, Clara walked them to the door herself. She bent to brush a strand of hair from Zoe's face. "You played beautifully," she said. "You reminded this old house how to breathe again." Zoe smiled sleepily. "Maybe next time you play with me." Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe I will." Malcolm helped Zoe into her coat. "Thank you for dinner," he said quietly. Clara met his eyes. "Thank you for staying." He paused, then replied, "Some dinners are worth more than any meeting." She smiled, small, fragile, real. Outside, the night was calm, the air faintly salted by the sea. As they walked back to the car, Zoe looked up at him. "She's not sad anymore, is she?" Malcolm thought for a moment, glancing at the lit windows behind them. "No," he said. "She's learning to play again." Inside the townhouse, Clara stood by the piano, fingers brushing lightly over the keys. Then softly, almost shyly, she pressed one note. It rang out, thin, uncertain, but alive. And in that fragile sound, the cold inside the Beaumont house finally began to thaw. Snow returned to Halifax like a rumor, quiet at first, then everywhere. It fell over the harbor cranes, over the wind-shine roofs, over the silver glass of Beaumont Tower, where the storm inside was colder than the one outside. By Monday, Clara Beaumont's name was everywhere. Headlines blared across financial news feeds. "Beaumont heiress undermines family legacy." Investors question CEO's emotional agenda. Sources board in crisis over political activism. Marcus Holcomb's media machine was fast and merciless. He knew exactly which strings to pull. Anonymous sources whispered that Clara had lost her grip, that her so-called transparency campaign was anti-corporate, reckless, personal. By midweek, 3 major investors had called for stabilization measures. Translation: silence her. At sunrise, Clara stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of her office, the city a blur beneath a white haze. Her reflection looked like a ghost, still hollow-eyed, dressed in resolve that didn't quite fit. "Damage control," her communications chief urged from the corner. "You need to release a statement. Neutral, professional, non-confrontational." Clara didn't move. "Non-confrontational?" "Yes. Something like, the company remains focused on growth and innovation. No mention of the foundation, no politics." "No truth either," she murmured. He hesitated. "Truth is complicated right now." She turned slowly, her expression calm, but final. "So, is silence." At that exact moment, in the underground garage, Malcolm's phone vibrated. A message from security. "Report to compliance office immediately." He knew the tone, that blend of politeness and suspicion. Upstairs, 2 men in suits were waiting, their badges clipped to their belts. "Mr. Jennings," one began, "we're conducting an internal review of unauthorized recordings. It seems you're involved in collecting audio material during a private meeting." Malcolm met his gaze evenly. That audio exposed threats against a child. "Nevertheless," the man said, his voice rehearsed, "we'll need to seize the surveillance equipment in your vehicle." Malcolm folded his arms. "So, you're removing the only eyes that tell the truth." The man smiled thinly. "We're ensuring compliance." By the time Malcolm returned to the garage, The red light above his dashboard camera was dark. The eye that had once blinked in judgment was gone. He sat behind the wheel, breathing in the silence that followed. Too clean, too empty. Then he whispered to no one, "If silence is safe, then safety is slavery." The next day, Clara called him to her office. Her voice was clipped, strained. "They've cut surveillance access from your car." "Completely," Malcolm said, "which means they're scared." She nodded slowly. "They want to isolate me, make me a headline, not a person." He looked at her, the exhaustion in her eyes framed by defiance. "Then give them something they can't twist." "What's that?" "The truth, out loud." Her gaze shifted toward the city skyline, washed in stormlight. "If I do that, there's no going back." He met her eyes. "You passed that line the moment you said her name." That night, Clara didn't go home. She stayed in her office, lights dimmed, reviewing documents, corporate filings, shareholder letters, old family memos. Her father's signature appeared everywhere, smooth and deliberate. The more she read, the heavier her hands became. Entire projects had been built on the silent removal of co-founders, scientists, laborers. Amelia Grant wasn't an exception. She was the blueprint. When dawn broke, Clara's assistant found her still awake, a half-empty cup of coffee cold beside her. "Ma'am, the PR team's asking for direction," he said carefully. She looked up, eyes red but clear. "Prepare a statement. I'm calling a press conference." He blinked. "To announce what?" Clara stood, gathering the papers scattered across her desk, the same ones her father once signed to erase others, to announce that silence is over. By mid-morning, the news broke. Clara Beaumont to hold public address Thursday morning. Marcus's phone buzzed within minutes. He laughed without humor. "She's going to burn the house down." Across the city, investors panicked. Emails flew, reduce exposure, delay funding, pause partnership announcements. In a quiet apartment on the south side, Malcolm watched the coverage on a flickering TV. The anchor's voice was smooth, detached. Speculation mounts as the Beaumont Group faces unprecedented internal turmoil. Sources close to the board say the CEO may be removed pending review. Zoe, sitting on the couch beside him with her homework spread out, looked up. "She's in trouble, isn't she?" He turned the volume down. "Yeah," he said softly. "But sometimes trouble's just what truth looks like at first." Zoe thought for a moment, then said, "You'll help her, right?" He smiled faintly. "Always." Outside, wind scraped snow against the windows. Malcolm stood and looked out toward the harbor, where the faint lights of the city blurred in the storm. He could feel it coming, not just the weather, but the reckoning. The next morning, Clara walked into the tower's lobby. Dozens of reporters were already gathering outside, flashes popping against the glass like distant lightning. Her assistant approached nervously. "The board's advising you to cancel, ma'am. They say it's too risky." She paused by the elevator doors, adjusting her coat. "You know what's riskier?" "What's that?" "Pretending to be the kind of company that erases people and still calling it leadership." The elevator chimed. She stepped inside. On the top floor, Malcolm waited by the entrance to the executive wing. When she emerged, their eyes met briefly, an unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had led to this moment. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. Clara took a deep breath. "No, but I'm done being sure of the wrong things." Together, they walked toward the conference hall, a place that had hosted countless presentations, shareholder briefings, and polished deceptions. Today, it would host something else, a truth spoken aloud, and somewhere deep beneath the storm clouds gathering over Halifax, the first tremor of change began to move. Small, quiet, but unstoppable. The storm outside Halifax had turned to freezing rain, glassing every surface in silver. By dawn, the front steps of Beaumont Tower gleamed like crystal, fragile, treacherous, and waiting. Inside, rows of cameras blinked to life, their red dots glowing like quiet sentinels, Reporters filled the hall, murmuring behind steaming coffee cups and glowing screens. Every word Clara Beaumont was about to speak would circle the world within minutes. At precisely 9:00 a.m., she entered. No entourage, no podium guards, only a small folder in her hands, and the composure of someone who had already decided not to flinch. Behind her, Malcolm stood near the back of the room, not as a driver now, but as witness. The weight of what was about to happen sat on both of them like gravity. Cameras clicked. The hum quieted. Clara stepped to the microphone. "Thank you for being here," she began. Her voice carried steady, not rehearsed, not defensive, but deliberate, human. For generations, the Beaumont name has stood for innovation and excellence. Those words are true, but not complete. A ripple moved through the crowd. Clara unfolded a page, her fingers steady. Our company was built on partnership, yet one name was erased from our history. Amelia Grant, co-founder, engineer, visionary. She was written out of the record by my own family. A dozen reporters leaned forward. Lights flared. Clara continued, eyes unwavering. "Today, I am restoring that name, and I am acknowledging the harm caused by silence." Behind her, the large screen flickered on. A video began to play. Snippets from internal meetings, board conversations, the very voices that had tried to bury truth. Marcus's voice filled the room, clear, cold, unmistakable. "You threaten the driver's kid, she'll back down. Fear is the oldest negotiation tool." Gasps rippled through the hall. Some reporters covered their mouths. Others began typing furiously. Clara stood motionless, letting the words hang, their ugliness undeniable in the clean light of morning. When the video ended, she spoke again. "These are not isolated comments. They are the sound of a system that confused power with worth. I will not let that system define us any longer." Her gaze swept the room, then found Malcolm near the back. "I want to thank one person," she said, "a man who reminded me that courage doesn't always speak loudly. Sometimes it drives quietly through the silence." All eyes turned to Malcolm. He didn't move, but something in his stance, calm, unbowed, said enough. Clara's voice softened. "We will name our next innovation center after Amelia Grant. We will fund scholarships for engineers from marginalized communities, and we will make public every record that was hidden." The room erupted with questions, flashes, microphones, chaos. Clara stayed composed, answering what she could, refusing to step back. By evening, every major outlet carried the story. Beaumont CEO restores erased co-founder. Corporate truth comes to light. Courage drives change, says Beaumont executive. The backlash Marcus had hoped for never arrived. Instead, something unexpected happened. The public rallied. Former employees sent letters of support. Universities called to collaborate. Even the stock, after an initial dip, began to rise again, this time on integrity rather than illusion. At dusk, Halifax's skyline glowed under a pale stormlight. Inside a small apartment on the south side, Malcolm turned off the TV. The last news headline faded, replaced by quiet. Zoe sat on the couch, drawing with colored pencils. "Daddy," she said, holding up her paper, "I made a new one." He leaned over. 3 stick figures stood under a rainbow, one tall, one small, and one in between holding a bright yellow flower. "What's this one called?" he asked. 3 under the rainbow, she said proudly. "It's us." He smiled. The kind of smile that came from deep down, the kind he hadn't felt in years. "It's perfect." Outside, the wind brushed against the window pane, a low hum like memory turning into peace. Malcolm sat beside his daughter, arms around her, the glow of the lamp reflecting in her eyes. On the wall, her earlier drawing still hung, faded crayon lines of the same 3 figures, now illuminated by the soft, forgiving light of evening. For a long moment, he just watched her, the small rise and fall of her breath, the safety he had fought so hard to keep. Somewhere across the city, Clara stood in her penthouse by the piano, tracing a single note that lingered after being struck. For once, she didn't flinch at its echo. Two people, worlds apart yet bound by a single act of defiance, had rewritten what legacy meant. In the quiet glow of the room, Malcolm whispered to no one in particular, maybe to the night itself. Truth drives farther than fear ever could. Zoe leaned against him, half asleep, her fingers still clutching the crayon, and as the lights of Halifax shimmered beyond the window, father and daughter sat beneath the faint colors of a paper rainbow. A small unspoken reminder that storms end, but the light that follows stays. Spring came to Halifax quietly that year, as if the city itself needed time to thaw. The harbor ice cracked in long, slow sighs, and gulls circled the water like they were relearning freedom. The wind still carried a chill, but it was softer now. Not the kind that punished, but the kind that reminded you you'd survived another winter. Inside the newly restored west wing of Beaumont Tower, banners hung beneath a fresh emblem, the Amelia Grant Foundation. The letters were clean, carved in brushed steel, mounted against a wall of reclaimed wood. Beneath them, a simple inscription read, "For the erased, for the builders, for those who begin again." The launch day had been scheduled for weeks, but no one could have prepared for the sight that morning. Engineers, community leaders, veterans, young students in borrowed suits and hand-me-down shoes, all standing shoulder to shoulder under the same roof. Clara Beaumont stood at the podium, not behind glass or flanked by executives, but in the open, sunlight spilling across her notes. Her voice carried a steadiness that came from something deeper than confidence, something closer to conviction. "When we talk about legacy," she began, "we often imagine statues and surnames. But legacies aren't carved from marble. They're built from work, courage, and names that endure when others are forgotten." She paused, scanning the faces before her. Miners from Cape Breton, veterans from the South Side, single mothers holding their children's hands. The Amelia Grant Foundation exists to make sure no name, no contribution, no spark of brilliance ever vanishes again. Our scholarships will support young engineers, especially those whose families built this country from beneath the ground or beneath the uniform. Applause filled the atrium. Clara waited, her gaze steady, then smiled slightly. "And this foundation isn't just mine. It belongs to every hand that lifted it." She turned toward the stage edge. "Malcolm Reed, would you join me?" A ripple moved through the crowd. Malcolm rose from his seat in the second row, adjusting his suit jacket, his first one. Zoe had helped him pick it out the week before. The applause rose again as he stepped onto the platform. Claire extended her hand. "This man taught me what it means to act when silence seems safer. He reminded me that truth doesn't travel alone. It's driven." Malcolm shook her hand, his voice low but clear enough for the microphone to catch. "And sometimes it's chauffeured." The crowd laughed softly, the tension breaking, warmth filling the room like morning light. Clara nodded to the audience. "It's my honor to announce that Malcolm Reed will serve as Executive Director of Community Development for the Foundation, a role created not by hierarchy, but by trust." The applause this time was louder, lasting longer. Somewhere near the front, Zoe clapped so hard her drawing book fell to the floor. When the noise settled, Clara turned to him and spoke softly so that only those near the stage could hear. "You built this with your silence and your stand." Malcolm looked at the banner above them, the name that had once been buried, now etched into steel. "No," he said quietly. "We built it with names." Clara held his gaze for a moment. Something like gratitude flickered there, fragile and human. Then she stepped aside, giving him the podium. Malcolm wasn't a man who liked speeches. But he wasn't the same man who once drove in silence either. He adjusted the microphone and let the room settle. "When I started working here," he began, "I didn't think my voice belonged in rooms like this. I was hired to drive, to move quietly, to take orders, to disappear when the door closed. But something happened along the way. I realized silence doesn't protect dignity. It buries it." The audience leaned in. "My father worked in the mines outside Sydney. My brother served overseas. Both came home to a world that forgot their names the moment their work was done. So today, when I stand here, not as a driver, not as an employee, but as a witness, I do it for them, and for every person who's ever been told their story didn't matter." Applause broke again, not the polite kind, the kind that starts deep, like an exhale people didn't know they'd been holding. Malcolm smiled faintly, then turned to look at Zoe, who sat beaming in the front row, feet swinging above the floor. "And for that little girl down there," he added, "who reminds me every day that names, like hope, are only lost when we stop speaking them." The crowd rose to their feet. When the ceremony ended, the hall stayed alive with movement. Laughter, cameras flashing, old friends embracing. Students filled out scholarship forms at the far end of the room. Veterans exchanged handshakes. The hum of renewal was everywhere. Clara found Malcolm standing near the display wall, where a framed photo of Amelia Grant now hung beside a blueprint of her early turbine design. The picture showed a woman with calm eyes, sleeves rolled up, grease on her hands. Not a ghost anymore, but a part of the story again. "She looks like she's watching over us," Clara said softly. Malcolm nodded. "Maybe she is." For a moment, they stood in silence, not the heavy kind, but the shared, earned kind. Outside, sunlight cut through the clouds, glinting against the harbor water. Clara turned toward him. "There's more work to do." "There always is," he said. Zoe ran up to them, holding a flyer she'd been coloring. "Daddy, look, I drew a logo for the foundation." It was a child's version of the real one, the same steel letters, but drawn in crayon with a rainbow arching above the name. Clara crouched to Zoe's level. "That's perfect," she said. "You've given us what every building needs. Color." Zoe grinned. "You can have it." Clara took the paper as if it were made of glass. "Thank you, Zoe. I'll hang it in my office." Malcolm rested a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Looks like you've got a new artist on the team." Clara smiled. "And we could use a few." As people began to leave, Clara and Malcolm stepped out onto the terrace overlooking the city. The wind smelled of salt and thawing earth. Below them, the harbor glittered under the first clear sky of spring. "Do you ever think about how far it's come?" she asked. He followed her gaze. "Sometimes. But it's not about how far. It's about who walked beside you." Clara nodded slowly, the truth of it sinking deep. "Then I'm grateful it was you." They stood there, quiet, watching gulls dip across the water, the sound of hammers echoing from a nearby construction site, a reminder that rebuilding never really ends. Behind them, inside the new foundation lobby, sunlight glinted across the wall where the dedication plaque read, "The Amelia Grant Foundation for the Erased, for the workers, for the ones who lift others by name." And beneath it, a small handwritten note Zoe had added in crayon. "No more missing names." Malcolm smiled when he saw it later that afternoon. Sometimes, he thought, history doesn't need rewriting, just remembering loud enough. Spring arrived in Halifax like a long exhale, slow, tender, and full of second chances. The harbor, once locked in sheets of gray ice, shimmered again with life. The scent of salt and thawing wood drifted through the docks, mingling with the faint hum of cranes and the laughter of gulls returning home. The city had changed, not loudly, not all at once, But in the quiet, steady way light changes a room after dawn. That morning, Malcolm, Clara, and Zoe walked side by side through the renovated energy plant that once bore the Beaumont name. The vast glass walls caught the sunlight, scattering it into prisms across the polished floor. Above the entrance, the new logo gleamed, Amelia Grant Solar Initiative. Inside, workers moved with calm purpose. Engineers, apprentices, veterans, single parents, retrained through new programs. It no longer felt like a monument to power, but a workshop for dignity. The hum of machines blended with conversation and warmth. Clara paused by one of the solar arrays, its mirrored panels angling toward the rising sun. She watched their reflection, 3 figures standing together against the light. For once, she didn't look like a woman carrying the weight of legacy. She looked like someone who had finally learned how to share it. Zoe tugged at her father's hand. "Daddy, are the bad people gone?" Malcolm looked down, his face softening. He crouched beside her so they were eye to eye. "Not gone," he said gently. "Just seen." She frowned, thinking. "Is that better?" He smiled. "It's the beginning." Clara turned, hearing them, and nodded quietly. "When people are seen, they can't hide behind shadows anymore. That's how change starts." Zoe tilted her head. "Then we're changers." Malcolm chuckled. "Something like that." They continued walking, the sound of their footsteps blending with the rhythmic hiss of turbines. On the far wall, sunlight filtered through the panels, casting the logo's reflection across the concrete. Amelia Grant Solar Initiative glowing gold, like a signature rewritten by time. Malcolm stopped near a small corner where an unfinished section of wall waited for a dedication plate. In his hands, he carried a modest wooden plaque, hand-carved, the edges sanded smooth by Zoe herself. He knelt, pressing it gently into place beneath a beam of sunlight. The words etched into it were simple. "Integrity keeps us standing." For a moment, no one spoke. Clara stood beside him, eyes glistening, her reflection shimmering in the solar glass. Zoe traced the carved letters with her small fingers, whispering them as if learning a new spell. Malcolm rose, wiping a speck of dust from his hands. "There," he said softly. "Now it's finished." Clara turned to him. "No," she said, smiling. "Now it begins." They stepped outside, where the air was alive with the scent of sea and new beginnings. Across the harbor, the city's skyline caught the morning light. The same glass towers that once felt like cages now gleaming with something cleaner. Zoe ran ahead, chasing the spray of a fountain that had just started flowing again after the winter freeze. Her laughter carried on the breeze, bright and untamed. Malcolm and Clara watched her, 2 silhouettes framed by sunlight and sea mist. "She's growing fast," Clara said. Malcolm nodded. The world's catching up to her. They walked toward the pier, where the waves slapped softly against the wood. Ships moved in the distance. Tankers, ferries, a single fishing boat returning from the dawn. Clara tucked her hair behind her ear and looked toward the horizon. "It's strange," she said quietly, "how everything that broke us became what built this." Malcolm's voice was low, thoughtful. "Sometimes what we fix doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be honest." A long silence followed, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. Then Clara smiled, the sunlight catching the faint silver in her hair. "You know, I think Halifax looks different now." "It does," he said. "But maybe it's us who changed." Behind them, the energy plant gleamed like a living mirror. Glass, steel, and the ghosts of names once erased, now shining in the light of acknowledgement. As they turned back toward the car, Zoe raced to catch up, slipping her small hand into Clara's and then into her father's. They walked together, their shadows merging into one. By the time they reached the gate, the wind from the harbor picked up, carrying the faint metallic scent of the sea. Salt, steel, and promise. Malcolm looked over his shoulder one last time. The plaque caught the sun, its letters glowing against the wall. Integrity keeps us standing." He smiled. "That's enough," he murmured. Zoe looked up. "Enough for what?" "For tomorrow," he said. As they walked down the pier, the gulls rose above them, wings slicing through the bright air. The harbor shimmered, endless and alive. Somewhere behind them, in the hum of turbines and the soft crash of the waves, history had found its balance, not rewritten, but restored. And as the last traces of winter melted into seafoam and light, Halifax stood tall again, held up not by legacy or wealth, but by something far quieter, far stronger, the simple, enduring grace of integrity.